The most dangerous secret in any room is not the one being spoken. It is the one everyone assumes nobody understands. My name is Daniel Brooks, and the night my marriage truly changed began with a business dinner in downtown Chicago. The restaurant sat on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the city skyline. From our table, near the windows, the lights stretched for miles beneath the dark evening sky. Expensive suits filled the dining room. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying plates that looked more like artwork than food. Everything about the evening was designed to impress. Rebecca sat beside me, confident as always. At 42, she had become one of the top account executives at her company. Her reputation seemed to grow every year. Promotions came quickly. Clients respected her. Executives trusted her. I was proud of her success. At least I had been for a very long time. Across from us sat Kenji Nakamura, an important client visiting from Tokyo. His company was considering a major partnership worth millions of dollars. Rebecca had spent months preparing for this meeting. She wanted everything to be perfect. From the moment we arrived, she took control of the conversation. Her smile was polished. Her posture was flawless. Her confidence filled the room. I mostly listened while the discussion moved from business to travel and eventually to personal stories. About 30 minutes into dinner, something changed. Kenji asked Rebecca a question in Japanese. She answered immediately in fluent Japanese. That was not unusual. Rebecca often used foreign languages with international clients. What surprised me was the direction the conversation suddenly took. Kenji glanced toward me and said something while smiling politely. Rebecca laughed softly before responding in Japanese. The moment she spoke, I felt a familiar sensation. Not surprise. Recognition. Because unlike what she believed, I understood every word, every sentence, every joke, every detail. Years before I met Rebecca, I had spent nearly 7 years living and working in Tokyo. I learned the language the hard way, through long workdays, late-night study sessions, and countless conversations with colleagues. By the time I returned to the United States, Japanese had become as natural to me as English. Yet very few people knew that. I never talked about it. There was rarely a reason to. Rebecca knew I had worked overseas. She never asked many questions. Eventually, she simply assumed I knew a few polite phrases and nothing more. I never corrected her. At first, it seemed harmless. That night, it became something else entirely. Rebecca smiled at Kenji and replied in Japanese. My husband looks interested, but he probably has no idea what we are discussing. Both of them laughed lightly. I lifted my water glass and took a small sip. My expression never changed. Kenji responded with another comment. Rebecca leaned closer and answered. Business negotiations are not really his world. Another smile. Another laugh. Another sentence. Each one landed with surprising accuracy. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. Honest reflections of how she apparently saw me. Throughout the evening, the conversation continued. Rebecca described herself as the ambitious one in our marriage. The driven one. The successful one. Several times she implied that I struggled to keep up with her professional world. Kenji listened politely. Occasionally he nodded. Sometimes he laughed. All while believing I remained completely unaware. The strange thing was that I did not feel angry. At least not immediately. Mostly I felt curious. Curious how long she had viewed me this way. Curious how many similar conversations had happened when she thought I could not understand. Curious whether the woman sitting beside me realized she was revealing far more about herself than she was about me. Outside the windows, Chicago shimmered beneath the night sky. Inside, glasses clinked softly against the table. Conversations flowed around us. Nobody noticed anything unusual. To everyone else, it looked like a successful business dinner. A confident executive entertaining an important client, while her supportive husband listened quietly. Yet beneath that polished surface, a completely different conversation was unfolding. One built on assumptions. One built on arrogance. One built on a secret neither of them realized I already knew. As Rebecca continued speaking in Japanese, smiling between every sentence, I sat comfortably in my chair and listened to every single word. And with each passing minute, I began to understand that this dinner was going to become far more important than anyone at the table expected. Most people assume intelligence announces itself. They imagine it arrives with titles, awards, or impressive introductions. In my experience, The smartest people in any room are usually the quietest. As Rebecca continued speaking with Kenji, I found myself thinking about a version of my life she barely remembered. Long before she became a rising executive, long before we bought our house outside Chicago, and long before either of us imagined building a future together, I had been living nearly 6,000 miles away in Tokyo. I was 27 when my company offered me an overseas assignment that was supposed to last 12 months. 12 months became 7 years. At first, Japan felt overwhelming. The streets moved faster. The customs felt unfamiliar. Even simple tasks like ordering lunch required effort. I spent countless evenings sitting in tiny apartments surrounded by language textbooks while the sounds of the city drifted through open windows. Progress came slowly. Some days I felt confident. Other days I felt completely lost. But eventually something changed. The language stopped feeling foreign. Conversations became natural. Colleagues stopped switching to English around me. I learned how business relationships worked. I learned what was said directly and what was communicated indirectly. Most importantly, I learned to listen. Real understanding rarely comes from speaking. It comes from paying attention. Those years shaped me more than any other period of my life. Yet after returning to the United States, I rarely talked about them. Not because they were unimportant, because they felt personal. Rebecca and I met about 2 years after I came home. Back then she loved hearing stories about Tokyo. She would ask questions about train stations, business culture, and neighborhood restaurants. Sometimes we would sit together for hours while I shared memories from overseas. Somewhere along the way, those conversations disappeared. Life became busy. Careers expanded. Responsibilities multiplied. The details that once fascinated her slowly faded into the background. Eventually, my years in Japan became little more than a brief fact attached to my biography. Something she knew existed but never thought about. Sitting at that dinner table, I realized just how completely she had forgotten. Across from us, Kenji asked another question in Japanese. Rebecca answered quickly. Her confidence impressed him. I could see it in the way he nodded. Then she glanced toward me and smiled politely before making another comment. He is very dependable, she said in Japanese. Just not particularly interested in international business. The irony almost made me laugh. For 7 years, international business had been my entire world. I remained silent. Not because I lacked a response. Because revealing everything immediately would accomplish nothing. People reveal far more when they believe they are safe. The dinner continued. Plates arrived and disappeared. The city lights sparkled beyond the windows. Rebecca seemed increasingly comfortable. Every passing minute reinforced her belief that her private commentary remained private. Kenji eventually asked how long we had been married. Rebecca answered. Then she added something that caught my attention. We are very different people. I am the ambitious one. She said it lightly, almost jokingly. Yet there was truth beneath the humor. Kenji chuckled politely. Rebecca continued. Daniel prefers a simpler life. I studied the reflection of the skyline in my water glass. Simpler life. The phrase lingered in my mind. Not because simplicity is a flaw. Because she said it with subtle dismissal. As if contentment and lack of ambition were the same thing. The strange part was that years earlier, she would never have described me that way. Rebecca used to admire my patience. My stability. My ability to stay calm under pressure. Somewhere during her climb up the corporate ladder, those qualities stopped looking like strengths. They started looking ordinary. Success changes people sometimes. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it simply alters what they choose to value. Another round of conversation began. Kenji mentioned future expansion plans in North America. Rebecca leaned forward enthusiastically. I listened carefully. Beneath the friendly atmosphere, important negotiations were already taking shape. Decisions worth millions of dollars were quietly forming between casual comments and polite laughter. Most people at nearby tables saw only a business dinner. I saw something else. I saw assumptions being made. I saw opportunities being missed. And most importantly, I saw my wife building an entire picture of me based on what she believed I could not understand. The evening was still young. The real conversation had not even begun yet. But one thing was already becoming clear. The more Rebecca spoke, the more she revealed that the person she thought she was describing no longer existed anywhere except inside her own imagination. The dinner moved into its second hour, and with every passing minute, I found myself learning less about Kenji and more about Rebecca. That was the unexpected part. Most people think secrets reveal hidden information. In reality, they reveal character. The restaurant remained filled with the quiet confidence of corporate success. Crystal glasses reflected the city lights. Conversations drifted from table to table. A pianist somewhere near the bar played soft instrumental music that blended into the background. Everything looked polished. Everything looked professional. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Rebecca seemed completely at ease now. The more comfortable she became, the less careful she was. At one point, Kenji complimented her negotiation skills. Rebecca thanked him and then responded in Japanese with a comment she clearly believed would never reach my ears. Someone has to handle the important decisions in our family. Kenji laughed politely. I smiled faintly and continued eating. The comment itself did not bother me. What caught my attention was how natural it sounded coming from her, as though she had repeated similar thoughts many times before. A few years earlier, Rebecca would have described our marriage differently. We used to make decisions together. We used to celebrate each other's achievements. When one of us succeeded, both of us felt proud. Somewhere along the road, success had stopped being something shared. It had become something measured, compared, ranked. The change happened gradually enough that I barely noticed it at first. After her promotion 3 years earlier, she began traveling more frequently. Her schedule grew busier. Her responsibilities expanded. None of that was unusual. The difference appeared in smaller moments. She stopped asking for my opinion on important choices. She interrupted more often when I spoke. She began introducing me differently at professional events. Not as someone she admired. Not as a partner. More as a supportive background character in the story of her success. I never confronted her about it. Partly because I assumed it was temporary. Partly because I believed strong relationships survived difficult seasons. Looking back, I realize I spent years giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who had already changed the way she viewed me. Across the table, Kenji mentioned another executive who would be joining future discussions. Rebecca immediately became enthusiastic. The conversation shifted toward long-term strategy and expansion plans. This was the part of the evening that genuinely interested me. International partnerships are rarely built on contracts alone. They are built on trust, respect, cultural understanding. Those details often matter more than numbers. As they spoke, I noticed something Rebecca seemed to miss. Several times, Kenji chose his words very carefully. His phrasing carried subtle hesitation. In Japanese business culture, direct disagreement is often avoided. Concerns are expressed indirectly. Signals are delivered through tone, wording, and context. To someone unfamiliar with those patterns, everything might sound positive. To someone who understood them, warning signs were already appearing. Rebecca continued speaking confidently. She interpreted every response as encouragement. Meanwhile, I heard uncertainty beneath the politeness. The gap between what was being said and what was actually meant continued growing wider. Then came another moment that revealed more than she intended. Kenji asked how Rebecca managed work-life balance. She smiled and answered in Japanese. Fortunately, my husband never competes for attention. The comment earned another polite laugh. She continued. He is very easygoing. Sometimes almost too easygoing. I glanced toward the city skyline beyond the glass. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness. For the first time that evening, I felt something close to disappointment. Not because of the insult, because of the accuracy with which she believed it. Rebecca genuinely thought she understood me completely. She believed my silence came from lack of ambition. She believed my patience came from passivity. She believed calmness meant weakness. The irony was almost impressive. Some of the strongest decisions in my life had been made quietly. Moving across the world at 27. Building a career overseas. Starting over in a foreign culture. None of those choices required loud confidence. They required discipline. Yet people often underestimate what they do not immediately recognize. The conversation continued while coffee was served and dessert menus appeared. Around us, other diners began leaving. The skyline glowed beneath the dark horizon. Rebecca remained focused on impressing the client. Kenji remained polite, and I remained silent. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became of one thing. This dinner was heading toward a problem neither of them could see yet. Because while Rebecca believed she understood the room better than anyone else, she was missing the most important conversation taking place right in front of her. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere at the table had become noticeably different. although Rebecca seemed completely unaware of it. The restaurant staff cleared the dinner plates and replaced them with coffee cups and small desserts arranged with almost artistic precision. Outside, the city glowed beneath the dark sky. Inside, conversations around us gradually softened as the evening moved toward its final stage. This was where important business dinners often became truly important. Once the formal discussions ended, people relaxed. They spoke more openly. Real opinions emerged. Real concerns surfaced. And that was exactly what began happening with Kenji. He set down his coffee cup and spoke in Japanese, his tone more thoughtful than before. Rebecca immediately leaned forward, eager to continue building momentum. At first, the conversation sounded positive. Future meetings, potential expansion, additional opportunities. But beneath the polite wording, I heard something else. Several times, Kenji used phrases that suggested hesitation. Not rejection, not yet, but concern. Rebecca missed every one of them. She responded with polished confidence, interpreting his diplomatic language as enthusiasm. The problem was that Japanese business culture often treats direct disagreement as impolite. Concerns are rarely announced. They are suggested, hinted at, wrapped carefully inside respectful language. If you are not listening closely, you hear agreement where none exists. I watched Rebecca smiling as she outlined ambitious projections for the partnership. Kenji nodded politely. Then he asked a question that immediately caught my attention. He mentioned long-term leadership stability within her company. It sounded simple on the surface. Rebecca answered quickly, assuring him that everything was secure. But that was not what he was actually asking. The real question hidden underneath was trust. He wanted to know whether the company would remain reliable 5 years from now, whether leadership changes might affect the relationship, whether promises being made today would still matter later. Rebecca gave him numbers. He wanted reassurance. The difference was subtle but important. Kenji thanked her politely and took another sip of coffee. Then he exchanged a brief glance with one of his associates seated farther down the table. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed it. I did, because I had seen that look countless times during my years in Tokyo. It was the look people exchanged when concerns remained unresolved. Rebecca continued confidently. Then, perhaps feeling particularly comfortable, she shifted the conversation again. This time, she decided to make another comment about me. In Japanese, she smiled and said, "Fortunately, Daniel never worries about these things. He leaves complicated business matters to professionals." A few people at the table laughed politely. Kenji smiled as well. I remained calm. Yet this comment felt different from the earlier ones. Not because it was more insulting, because it revealed something important. Rebecca genuinely believed she occupied a different world than I did now. A higher world. A more sophisticated world. Success had not simply changed her career. It had changed the way she measured people. Meanwhile, the concerns on the client side continued growing. Kenji introduced another topic involving future cooperation between divisions. Once again, Rebecca answered quickly. Once again, she missed what was actually being communicated. As I listened, a realization slowly formed. This was no longer just an awkward dinner conversation. The entire deal was beginning to drift in the wrong direction. Neither side realized it yet. Rebecca believed everything was progressing perfectly. Kenji remained too polite to openly challenge her interpretations. The gap between them widened with every exchange. And because everyone assumed I was simply an observer, nobody considered the possibility that someone else at the table understood exactly what was happening. Another 10 minutes passed. Then Kenji asked perhaps the most important question of the evening. His wording was careful, deliberate, respectful. He wanted to know how potential disagreements would be handled once the partnership began. Rebecca immediately launched into another confident explanation. As she spoke, I noticed something alarming. The more she talked, the less convinced Kenji appeared. His smile became smaller. His responses became shorter. His questions became increasingly cautious. To Rebecca, everything still looked successful. To me, the warning signs were impossible to miss. By now, I was no longer listening because of what Rebecca said about me. That had become almost irrelevant. I was listening because a multi-million-dollar opportunity was quietly slipping away in real time. The tragedy was that nobody at the table seemed aware of it. Not Rebecca, not her colleagues, not even the executives seated nearby. They all saw polite smiles and respectful conversation. I saw uncertainty growing with every passing minute. And as the evening continued, I began to suspect that before this dinner ended, someone would have to address the misunderstanding that was slowly pulling the entire negotiation toward failure. The longer I listened, the more obvious the hidden problem became. It was not language. It was not numbers. It was trust. Every major business relationship eventually reaches a point where spreadsheets stop matching and people start matching. Kenji was approaching that point. Rebecca did not see it. She remained focused on performance, projections, and quarterly goals. Those things were important, but they were not the questions sitting behind his careful wording. He wanted to know whether the people across the table truly understood the kind of partnership his company valued. As coffee cups emptied and waiters quietly refilled water glasses, Kenji began speaking about a previous partnership that had failed several years earlier. His tone remained calm and professional. To most listeners, it sounded like a simple business story. To me, it sounded like a warning. He described communication problems, leadership changes, promises that slowly disappeared once contracts were signed. He never directly criticized the former partner. That was not his style. Instead, he shared the story the way many experienced executives do when they want to test the character of the people sitting across from them. Rebecca nodded sympathetically and immediately shifted the conversation toward the strengths of her own company. Once again, she missed the deeper purpose behind the question. Kenji was not asking about strengths. He was asking about reliability. The distinction mattered. I noticed one of Kenji's associates quietly writing notes. Another exchanged a brief glance with him. Their body language became increasingly reserved. None of it was dramatic. None of it would have stood out to someone unfamiliar with Japanese business culture. Yet every signal pointed in the same direction. Confidence was slipping away. Rebecca remained completely unaware. In fact, she appeared more confident than ever. At one point she laughed and responded in Japanese. "You do not have to worry. I always make sure things get done." The statement was intended to reassure. Instead, it created another problem. In many international partnerships, emphasizing individual control can unintentionally raise concerns. Successful long-term relationships depend on systems, teams, and continuity. Kenji was trying to understand the stability of the organization. Rebecca kept presenting herself as the solution. The gap widened further. Then came another comment directed toward me. Kenji asked whether I traveled internationally for work. Before I could answer, Rebecca smiled and replied in Japanese. "Daniel prefers staying far away from corporate negotiations." More laughter followed. He would probably be bored by these conversations. I kept my expression neutral. The truth was almost amusing. Not only was I following every word, I was probably the only person at the table who fully understood both sides of the discussion. Yet there was no satisfaction in that realization. Only curiosity. I wondered how much longer this could continue before the consequences became visible. The evening moved closer to its conclusion. Several nearby tables had already emptied. The city lights outside seemed brighter now against the dark horizon. Kenji glanced at his watch before returning to the discussion one final time. His next question immediately captured my attention. He asked Rebecca how disagreements would be resolved if future strategic priorities changed between the two companies. The wording sounded simple. The meaning was not. This was the most important question of the night. It was a direct invitation to discuss mutual respect, flexibility, and long-term cooperation. Rebecca answered with confidence, outlining internal procedures and reporting structures. Everything she said was technically correct. None of it addressed what he was actually asking. As she spoke, I watched Kenji's expression carefully. For the first time all evening, his smile faded completely. Not out of frustration, out of disappointment. He had been offering opportunities for deeper understanding throughout the dinner. One by one, they had been missed. His associates stopped taking notes. The energy at their side of the table changed noticeably. That was when I realized the situation had become more serious than even I initially believed. This was no longer a minor misunderstanding. The foundation of the potential partnership was beginning to crack before it had even been built. And the most remarkable part was that Rebecca still thought the evening had been a tremendous success. She sat comfortably in her chair, smiling confidently beneath the warm restaurant lighting, completely unaware that the deal she had worked months to secure was quietly drifting toward failure. I looked down at my coffee cup for a moment, then back toward Kenji. For the first time that night, I began seriously considering whether remaining silent was still the right decision. For several minutes, I said nothing. The easy choice was to remain silent and watch the evening conclude exactly as it was heading. After all, I had not created the misunderstanding. I had not spent 2 hours listening to hidden insults and assumptions because of anything I had done. Rebecca had chosen her words. Rebecca had chosen her attitude. Rebecca had chosen to underestimate both me and the situation unfolding in front of her. Yet as I looked across the table at Kenji, I found myself thinking about something one of my former mentors in Tokyo used to say. He believed character revealed itself most clearly when people had the opportunity to stay silent and chose responsibility instead. The deal mattered, not because of the money, not because of the executives involved. It mattered because dozens of employees on both sides would eventually depend on its success. Good people would benefit if the partnership worked. Bad communication should not be the reason it failed. Kenji finished speaking and folded his hands neatly on the table. A brief silence followed. Rebecca smiled confidently and prepared to continue. Then, for the first time all evening, I spoke. "If I may offer a thought," I said calmly. Rebecca turned toward me, visibly surprised. She probably assumed I was about to make some harmless social comment. Kenji nodded politely. "Of course," he replied in English. I looked at him for a moment, then answered in Japanese. "I believe the concern is not about procedures. It is about whether both companies will continue respecting each other when circumstances change." The effect was immediate. Kenji's eyes widened. One of his associates nearly dropped his pen. Across the table, Rebecca froze completely. The expression on her face was not anger, not embarrassment. It was pure disbelief. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background. Finally, Kenji leaned forward slightly. Then he answered me in Japanese. Not simple conversational Japanese. Not tourist Japanese. Fast, professional business Japanese. The kind used by executives who assume they are speaking with someone deeply familiar with the language. I responded without hesitation. Another silence followed. Rebecca stared at me as though she were looking at a stranger. "You speak Japanese?" she asked quietly. I glanced toward her. "I lived in Tokyo for 7 years." Her eyes blinked once, then twice. 7 years. The disbelief in her voice almost sounded genuine. Before she could say anything else, Kenji spoke again. This time his tone had changed completely. The cautious uncertainty that had followed him throughout the evening was gone. Instead, he sounded engaged, interested, curious. We spent the next several minutes discussing the exact concern he had been trying to express all night. The issue was not leadership structure. It was continuity of trust. He wanted reassurance that future disagreements would be handled collaboratively rather than competitively. He wanted confidence that both organizations viewed the partnership as long-term rather than transactional. Once the conversation moved into that territory, everything changed. The tension disappeared. His associates resumed taking notes. Questions became more direct. Answers became more productive. For the first time all evening, both sides were actually discussing the same issue. Rebecca remained unusually quiet. Every so often I caught her looking at me, then quickly looking away. She seemed unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one now speaking across the table. Kenji eventually smiled and shook his head slightly. "I must admit," he said in Japanese, "I spent the entire evening believing you did not understand a word." A faint smile crossed my face. "You were not the only one." For a brief moment, nobody said anything. The meaning behind the sentence hung quietly in the air. Kenji understood it immediately. One of his associates looked down to hide a smile. Rebecca's face turned noticeably pale. Yet I kept my tone calm, professional, controlled. There was no need for revenge. The truth was already doing all the work. Another 30 minutes passed. By the time the evening finally began winding down, the atmosphere at the table felt completely different from the one that existed earlier. Kenji was relaxed. His team appeared optimistic again. Business cards were exchanged. Future meetings were discussed. Momentum had returned. As everyone stood and prepared to leave, Kenji extended his hand toward me. "I am very glad you joined us tonight," he said. "So am I," I replied. Because standing there beneath the city lights, watching the stunned expression on Rebecca's face, I realized the most important conversation of the evening had never been the one about business. It was the one she had been having about me while believing I could not hear a single word. The elevator ride down from the restaurant felt longer than the entire dinner. Nobody said much at first. Kenji and his associates remained near the front of the group, quietly discussing future meetings. Rebecca walked beside me in complete silence. Every few seconds, I could feel her glance in my direction before quickly looking away again. It was the kind of silence that appears when a person suddenly realizes they have been operating with incomplete information for a very long time. Outside the building, the cool Chicago night air greeted us as the group stepped onto the sidewalk. The city buzzed with its usual energy. Traffic lights reflected off wet pavement. Taxis moved through intersections. People hurried between restaurants and hotels. Yet despite the movement around us, all attention seemed focused on the final moments of the evening. Kenji turned toward me before entering his waiting car. "Daniel," he said, speaking in Japanese once again. "I hope we will have another opportunity to continue our conversation." I smiled and shook his hand. I would enjoy that very much. His expression carried genuine respect now, not the polite courtesy he had shown earlier. Something deeper. One of his associates bowed slightly before entering the vehicle. Another handed me a business card and encouraged me to reach out if I ever visited Tokyo again. Rebecca watched the exchange without saying a word. I could almost see the questions forming behind her eyes. The cars eventually pulled away, disappearing into the flow of downtown traffic. For a few seconds, only Rebecca and I remained standing beneath the bright lights outside the building. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why did you never tell me?" Her voice was quiet. Not angry, not defensive, simply confused. I looked across the street where a train rattled along elevated tracks in the distance. "Tell you what." She stared at me. "That you speak Japanese." The question lingered between us. I considered the answer carefully before responding. "You never asked." Rebecca blinked. The simplicity of the reply seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth as if preparing another argument, then stopped. Because she knew it was true. Years ago, she had known about my time overseas. She had heard the stories. She had seen photographs. Over time, she simply stopped paying attention to that part of my life. We began walking toward the parking garage. The sound of our footsteps echoed softly against the concrete. After several moments, she spoke again. "How much did you understand tonight?" This time I looked directly at her. "All of it." She froze mid-step. The color drained from her face. For a moment, the city noise seemed to disappear entirely. "All of it," she repeated. I nodded once. Nothing more. No explanation. No accusation. The truth required no decoration. Rebecca turned away and stared across the garage. I could see the realization spreading through her mind. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every assumption she had shared, none of it had been hidden. None of it had been private. The entire evening suddenly looked very different from her perspective. We reached the car and climbed inside. The drive home felt unusually quiet. Streetlights passed across the windshield in steady intervals. Rebecca sat looking out the passenger window while I focused on the road. Several times it seemed as though she wanted to speak. Several times she changed her mind. Eventually she said, "Why did you not say something sooner?" I kept my eyes forward. Because I wanted to hear what people say when they believe there are no consequences. Another silence followed. This one lasted much longer. By the time we reached our neighborhood, the conversation had effectively ended. Yet something fundamental had changed. For years, Rebecca had viewed me through a lens built from assumptions. Tonight that lens cracked. Perhaps not completely, but enough. When we pulled into the driveway, neither of us moved immediately. The porch light illuminated the front yard. Everything looked normal, familiar, ordinary. Yet the atmosphere inside the vehicle felt entirely different from the one that existed a few hours earlier. Finally, Rebecca spoke one last time before opening the door. "I do not think I know you as well as I thought I did." I watched the warm light glowing from the house windows ahead of us. Then I answered with complete honesty. "I am beginning to realize the same thing." And as we stepped out into the quiet night, I understood that the biggest surprise of the evening was no longer the language I spoke. It was the fact that after all our years together, my wife had spent an entire dinner describing a man who existed only in her imagination. The following week brought a kind of quiet that felt unfamiliar inside our house. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no arguments, no emotional confrontations, no late-night speeches about marriage or trust. Instead, there was silence. Not hostile silence, reflective silence. The kind that appears when two people suddenly realize they have been living beside assumptions rather than realities. Rebecca threw herself into work almost immediately. Every morning, she left early and returned late. Yet something about her seemed different, less certain, more thoughtful. Several times I caught her studying me from across the room, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she had never noticed before. Meanwhile, life continued. I went to work. I met clients. I attended meetings. The ordinary rhythm of daily life remained unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, the consequences of that dinner continued unfolding. 3 days later, I received an email from Kenji. The message was professional and courteous. He thanked me again for the conversation and expressed optimism about the future partnership. More importantly, he mentioned that several concerns within his organization had been resolved after our discussion. Reading the message, I felt satisfied. Not because I had impressed anyone, because the misunderstanding had been prevented from becoming a larger problem. Later that evening, Rebecca came home carrying her laptop bag and a look I had not seen in years. Humility. She placed her things on the kitchen counter and hesitated before speaking. Michael called today. Michael Carter was the CEO overseeing her division. I nodded. How did it go? Rebecca stared at the floor for a moment. Apparently Kenji specifically mentioned you during a conference call. That caught my attention. She continued. He said your understanding of both business culture and communication helped save the direction of the negotiation. The kitchen grew quiet. Rebecca folded her arms and leaned against the counter. Michael asked why nobody at the company knew you had that background. I smiled faintly. Because I do not work for his company. For a brief moment, Rebecca almost laughed. Then her expression softened again. I spent years thinking I knew exactly who you were. The statement lingered between us. I poured a glass of water and waited. Eventually, she continued. The truth is, I stopped asking questions a long time ago. There was no defense in her voice. No attempt to justify anything. Just honesty. And strangely enough, honesty sounded different coming from her now. More genuine. More vulnerable. Over the next several days, small things began changing. Rebecca started asking about Tokyo. Not casually. Not out of politeness. With actual curiosity. One evening, she found an old photo album stored in a hallway closet. Together we sat at the dining room table while she flipped through photographs from years I had spent overseas. Tiny apartments, train stations, corporate events, neighborhood restaurants hidden inside narrow side streets. She stopped repeatedly to ask questions. Questions she could have asked years earlier. Questions she had never cared enough to ask. You never told me you managed teams over there, she said while looking at one picture. You never asked, I replied gently. This time, instead of looking offended, she nodded. Because she understood. The realization seemed to trouble her more than anything else. Not the language. Not the business dinner. Not even the embarrassment. What troubled her was discovering how little attention she had paid to the person sitting beside her all these years. The following Friday, another message arrived from Kenji. This one included an invitation. He would be returning to Chicago in several months and hoped we could meet again. The wording made it clear that the invitation was directed toward me personally. Rebecca read the email over my shoulder. Then she quietly walked to the window overlooking the backyard. For several seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. Do you know what bothers me most? I looked up. She smiled sadly. Everyone else saw value in parts of you that I stopped noticing. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the lawn. Inside, the house felt unusually calm. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not argue. Some truths need space to settle. And as I watched Rebecca standing quietly by the window, I realized the consequences of that dinner were still unfolding. Not in boardrooms, not in business contracts, but in something far more personal. For the first time in years, my wife was beginning to see the difference between the man she thought she married and the man who had been standing in front of her the entire time. Several months passed, and eventually the business dinner became one of those stories people mentioned occasionally before moving on to newer events. The partnership moved forward successfully. Meetings were scheduled. Contracts were finalized. Teams on both sides began working together. From a professional perspective, everything turned out well. Yet the most significant outcome had nothing to do with business. It happened quietly inside our home. Rebecca changed in ways I never expected. Not overnight. Real change rarely works that way. It arrived through small moments. She listened more carefully. She asked more questions. She stopped assuming she already knew the answers. One Saturday morning, nearly 6 months after the dinner, We sat together on the back patio drinking coffee while sunlight filtered through the trees behind our house. The air carried the first signs of autumn, reminding me of how much had changed since that evening in Chicago. Rebecca looked across the yard for several seconds before speaking. I spent years believing confidence meant knowing everything, she said. Now I think confidence might be admitting when you do not. I smiled slightly, but said nothing. There was no need. The lesson belonged to her. Over time, I realized something important as well. The problem had never been that Rebecca failed to know every detail of my past. No marriage survives because two people memorize each other's biographies. The real problem was that she stopped being curious. She stopped looking. She stopped asking who I was becoming because she assumed she already knew who I had always been. The danger of assumptions is that they slowly replace reality. You stop seeing the person in front of you and start seeing the version you created in your mind. One evening, while organizing old boxes in the garage, I found a photograph from my first year in Tokyo. The picture showed a younger version of me standing outside a train station beneath bright city lights. I brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. Rebecca picked it up and studied it for a long moment. "You look completely different," she said. I laughed. "That was almost 20 years ago." She shook her head. "That is not what I mean." Then she handed the photograph back. "I think I forgot that you had entire chapters of your life before me." The comment stayed with me. Because she was right. Not just about me. About everyone. Every person carries experiences, skills, failures, victories, and lessons that remain invisible unless someone takes the time to learn them. Respect begins with curiosity. Without curiosity, respect slowly disappears. A few weeks later, Kenji returned to Chicago for another round of meetings. This time Rebecca joined us for lunch along with several executives from both companies. The atmosphere was completely different. Relaxed. Comfortable. At one point, Kenji laughed and told the story of the famous dinner to one of the new executives. Everyone smiled. Even Rebecca. But when the laughter faded, Kenji added something I never forgot. The most valuable person in any room is often the one speaking the least. The table grew quiet for a moment. Then the conversation moved on. Yet his words lingered. Later that evening, after we returned home, Rebecca stood beside the kitchen window watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold across the horizon. Finally, she turned toward me. "You know," she said softly, "the worst part was never finding out you spoke Japanese." I raised an eyebrow. "No." She shook her head. "The worst part was realizing how much I stopped paying attention to someone I claimed to know better than anyone else." There was no defense in her voice. No attempt to rewrite the past. Just honesty. And honesty, when it arrives without excuses, carries a certain kind of dignity. I looked out the window beside her. The neighborhood was quiet. Lights were beginning to appear in nearby homes. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. The kind of lives built on thousands of small interactions that either strengthen relationships or slowly weaken them. Looking back, the lesson from that night in Chicago had never been about language. It had never been about business. It had never even been about embarrassment. It was about attention, about respect, about remembering that the people closest to us are often far more complex than we realize. Sometimes the biggest mistake is not underestimating a stranger. It is believing there is nothing left to discover about someone you stopped truly seeing years ago.